Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversants are Eliza Mondegreen and Laura Haynes. Laura works with, or has worked with, foster care youth as a court-appointed special advocate, and in this conversation we talk about how California is treating foster kids with regard to gender affirmation therapy. And turns out that California is putting the loco in loco parentis. And in this conversation, we dive into that. You can find Laura's work and Eliza's work linked in the description below. And if you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing, and donating via the tip jars below. Without further ado, here is Eliza Mondegreen and Laura Haynes. Have you looked into what the foster system in California is doing with regard to gender distressed youth?
Yes, they're very pro affirmation. And nearly from the moment of the Jason Rafferty AAP statement, I think that was it. I think this stuff, it's hard to know exactly because I was in an odd, cul-de-sac of that system and not privy to inner workings, but what I know is it came down the pike as affirmation is what we do by the end of 2018. And that Rafferty statement was, I think, October or November of 2018. So the timing suggests that they had, advanced work in lobbying social services around and about saying we're developing a guideline. And as soon as we can release our guideline, we'll let you know what it is,
Okay.
And then the moment it got released, the arguments had already been made or the, context had already been made because it was just quite rapid.
Do you think that there's got to be, you brought up lobbying, so there's got to be some sort of focused attention from NGOs? Of some sort
it's either
to pressure the
NGOs
system?
or Department of Health and Human Services. It's somebody was lobbying. It could, be the Trevor Project. It could be somebody like that. It could be more than one entity, lobbying in unison, which sort of it looks like.
It would be really convenient for people who want to stymie certain populations from reproducing to inject this option into the most vulnerable parts of.
Absolutely right. Or at least not feel as much trepidation about them not reproducing. And you even heard that from the Dutch clinicians, when they definitely said, like, these are kids who are not going to have a good life. They're going, they're going to be in all kinds of experiencing all kinds of social problems. So this one thing of not reproducing is sort of less horrific, or that's how it was portrayed in one of the Wider Lens podcasts that they were on. And I think it's probably more likely to be that developmental trauma is very intractable to the kinds of systematized therapies that are easy to give with an intern, like a unit of trauma-focused CBT, which is systematized. You do X, you suggest Y, you practice Z on meeting 1, meeting 2. And it's like, I think it's a 12-unit series, And that just doesn't touch a person who, if you give them an angry look, goes into a fugue state. Like they're in a fugue state. They're not going to think about, holding an ice cube for distress tolerance or whatever. They're just already out.
Okay.
It's involuntary. It's so early. Some of these trauma responses and fight or flight responses and things like that. If every time someone raised their voice, you wound up hit, then a raised voice puts you in a state of panic very quickly. And so trauma-focused CBT is probably a little more useful for if you had a bad car crash and you're having intrusive thoughts about it, because you've got some basic self-regulation ability already on board, and
Right. There was a time before the car crash.
and thus you might even recognize, oh, wait a minute, I think this is a flashback because
Mhm.
this isn't normal how I'm feeling, or oh wait, I'm seeing a visual disturbance, or whatever it might be. If you have a baseline, you know how far you are from baseline. And so I don't think, like, to give you an example of the youth that I work with, her body awareness was terrible. Um, we went on a big hike one time, and when we turned around she wanted me in the lead going up, and then we came down and she was in the lead. And I noticed the backs of her heels were bleeding,
Hmm.
like gushing. And she didn't have any idea. So that's an awful lot of I'm disconnected from my feelings
Mhm.
to protect myself, and just to stay in bubble wrap all the time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think getting back to what I was starting to say, when you have kids with this degree of problem, dissociation, can't focus, self-hatred, cutting, indiscriminate sex, um, thrill seeking, the kind of adrenaline junkie kinds of behaviors you might think about. When you have kids like this, and you throwing trauma behavioral therapy, CBT at them, and it's not really getting to their core issues, it's probably really tempting to be given something that's got this massive placebo effect,
Mhm.
clears a difficult kid from your problem kid list. They seem to be adapting or happy. If you have a depressed young girl and you give her testosterone, she's likely to liven up a little bit, since
Mhm.
it's this. So there's, I think there's partly a really bad lack of psychodynamic awareness among young clinicians, and a really elevated bunch of psychodynamic problems among the youths in the system. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, well, if they talk about gender, here's just a path, a chute they can go down.
Mhm.
And it probably just feels like, okay, I'm clearing my desk, um,
Hmm. Yeah,
if
and
you're
it
the
also,
social worker or whatever,
yeah,
and you've
and
been told.
it seems really similar to, I mean, it's like if a difficult patient comes across a clinician's desk, there's often not a whole lot that you can do. And there's very rarely something that a clinician can do for a patient who's really troubled that the patient actually wants. And then you have gender and the patient wants it and it works for a while. I would guess it's really similar with a social worker where these kids, they've had difficult lives, they're difficult cases. And then there's this one thing that they want, and it provides all of these things that it's meeting all of these needs that they really do have in a way for a while, where it's like, okay, you have a place to belong, you have a direction of travel, you have like a purpose in life, you have an identity, you have a meaning, you have an escape from the self, a way out of the self, which can be like a good thing in that we all need to be part of the wider world in some way, but a bad thing in that it can be, it can be self-rejection too. And I remember it was years ago that I was reading about, I think his name is William Wong in Vancouver, and he said that
Mm-hmm.
50% of his cases were
From
foster
foster
kids. And
community.
he was
Mm-hmm.
talking about how great that was. And it was like, but did you think about why?
What is he, a gender clinician, so
He's
Mm-hmm.
a
called?
gender clinician.
In Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yep.
And how
And I
great
think
that was that they're
like he said that it was a sign of a really progressive practice that he had so many kids in foster care. And it was like, did you ever think about why so many
huh.
of them are in foster care?
Like it's
And
just kind of
people,
basic critical thinking, you would think, to kind of reverse engineer, or at least be open to like more than one interpretation of that data point.
well, I think what happens is people leap to it's a trans kid who got kicked out of their
Mm-hmm.
teenage house,
Yes.
and they don't correctly posit that these kids are mostly infants and toddlers. The average age of surrender in California when I was active was under 3.
Okay.
So at 2.5, you are not going to see, you know, storming out of the house because you don't believe my pronouns, you know? So that's a misapprehension that probably means people gloss past the foster youth, the high
it's
incidence.
part of the narrative. And my understanding of California is that California is actually kind of recruiting youth to run away to California, come under the care of the state, and undergo gender affirming care. Is that?
I'm not sure if it's really recruiting, but yes, the legislature here and in Maine is another place, and I think Washington State and Oregon. There are several places where they're talking about kind of sanctuary state. If you are a kid and you're from Missouri and they've taken away your gender affirming care, come to California. If you come with your mother and your dad's not on board, come anyway.
But also if you come without a parent.
If you run away. So there's definitely and I blame the Rafferty statement Foursquare for this. There's definitely this sense of innate identity of transness is something California believes. They believe kids have this identity innately, and it's somewhat related to LGB, and they have a feeling that it is inhumane and just the same as being a homophobe not to accept this identity. But my question is, and where the thinking hasn't happened, is if you need a CASA to figure out whether or not you're going to mortician school, or to know whether it's a good idea to not go to Thanksgiving with your foster family, which they want you at, or, like if you need an adult to sort of troubleshoot so many decisions in life, why would this one decision be considered, just an unerring, that the kids could just make it unerringly? And, I mean, it boggles my mind that anybody who would actually spend 10 minutes working with these kids, like probably more social workers in the state of California feel like I feel than are saying something. Because if you're a social worker, you know what the level of functioning somebody has. You know how hard a time they have or don't have with basic things. So it ought to get your attention if they're being rushed down a path without critical thinking. And I feel, that's where I'm loud about it, because I feel like these kids have a right to appropriate psychiatric care. And they have a right to feel better and to use all of the low risk methods of feeling better and feeling whole and embodied. And every one of those needs to be tried before you even entertain gender for 1 second. I mean, go ahead and wear your hair how you want, but it just seems like it's complete dereliction of care, one of the principles we're supposed to use is in loco parentis. If you're a CASA, if you're a foster parent, if you're a social worker, the state of California has taken this child from their parents. So they have to act as parents. They've taken on that responsibility by removing them from their parents. And this is but they're trying to disempower parents from making, from thinking critically about this decision too.
Well, I mean, they really threaten parents. I've talked to a lot of parents in California who are worried that they'll lose their kids over not affirming gender. And these are, loving families that didn't have major problems until a gender problem came home.
Can you confirm that's going on in California? Has it gotten to the level of kids being taken from their parents?
It hasn't, that I know, gotten to the level. It's more that people are afraid of it.
But it's a threat that people feel.
And teachers are probably afraid about not validating pronouns, and therapists are afraid about saying, hey, could it be when your uncle molested you that gave you this problem with your breasts? They're afraid to do that. That's just basic. And the thing that as a CASA really concerns me is massive safeguarding fail, because these are kids who were probably molested in many cases or beaten or whatever. There are bad guys out there who are going, undiscovered if you never ask a kid a question about their distress. And so I think it's a matter of time until these questions percolate, into everyone's awareness. But right now, people are thinking, oh, yeah, they got kicked out of the house because they're trans.
Right.
Oh, of course you support, you don't bully a gender nonconforming kid. And of course, I agree with that, but they take it into an ignorant place on gender.
Yeah, something that I've been struck by in what you write. Well, I often kind of think about you and I have like two pieces of the same puzzle. And the piece that I have is the piece of like, okay, once there's a problem, what shape is it going to take and why? And the piece that you have that I'm always interested to read what you write about it is, okay, what went wrong here in the first place? That there was a problem that then got hooked on gender. And something that you've talked about a little bit that I've been really struck by was, talking about foster kids and other kids who've had a lot of like developmental traumas, that of course a lot of these kids are going to feel like they were rejected, even if that's not exactly what happened. And it's going to be really hard for them to accept themselves. And they are being sold this program of self-rejection that's dressed up as self-acceptance.
Exactly.
Of course it's appealing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's seductive, and they are kids who, more than the average kid, lack an ability to, a lot of these abilities of holding someone else's mind in your mind is very developmental. Mm-hmm. That is, being close to your own mother gives you the ability to metacognate and know, okay, I'm thinking I hate this idea, but she's my mother and she's making me do it, or I still love her even though I hate her. And that's metacognition, and if you never have an attachment, it's hard to develop. Or the ability, like, this seems bad, but it'll be okay. That's something you get from having been mothered. Like, when things get bad, someone makes it okay. Then you get the feeling deep down inside that, well, things sometimes are bad, but then they get okay again. Mm-hmm. And these kids, unfortunately, a lot of these foster kids and other kids falling into gender have the feeling like, when things get bad, I panic and do embarrassing things and lose people.
Yeah.
And so they're really scared. That's the other thing. They're being sold this bill of goods, but at the same time, they're really, really scared to go inside and say, how do I feel? Because what if how they feel is, is the explosive thing that they're terrified of feeling, So I think, and in the case of my youth, I think she was triggered by strong emotions. Mm-hmm. That was a trigger for her, was her own strong emotion, because where would it go? What could she do about it? Who would tolerate it? And so she'd just blank out and kind of go into mm-hmm. this fugue, dissociate in moments of strong disagreement, over dumb things, over like what shoes she was wearing or something. If her foster mother disagreed, she'd get very upset. So those are the lack of skills that you're talking about. And these are kids whose state of California is going, sure, okay. We celebrate you as a boy.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at a document from the government of California, Get Real California, Recognize, Engage, Affirm, Love, Center of Study of Social Policy, Family Builders, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And this is a transgender and gender nonconforming children in foster care. And so what the data suggests is that 5% of foster care children identify as having some sort of transgender identity. And it's really interesting because they say, it goes through all these bullet points of how to do it. And they say, by adopting and implementing gender-affirming policies and practices, child welfare agencies promote the safety, permanency, and well-being of T, G, and C children. And then later on, they say, well, how do you know if it's a transgender child? And they're like, well, you don't know, but the child will tell you. And they could have a very complex sense of self that'll be very fluid. So if we pair that up with what you're talking about the developmental deficiencies of trauma-informed development or whatever, like a child damaged by traumatic upbringing, who's going to have a problem with their self, doesn't know, probably is predisposed to variety or various forms of dissociation, lack of self-responsibility or even self-identity. And then you say, well, you get to choose what you are in this gender thing, and we will affirm, we're going to follow your lead on this. And hidden in this really nice phrase, gender affirming policies and practices, we're going to castrate you. We're going to modify your body. We're going to give you drugs. And then you're going to be very special to us because you are this thing called a trans kid. Now, all of a sudden, you're this trans kid. It's just such a fascinating concept. I don't know where it came from, but it turns people's brains off. It's just like, it's a trans kid. All questions are just gone.
Total exception.
It's like this unicorn just appears. This is a magical indigo child or something like that, the trans kid. But how do you know it's a trans kid? Well, they'll know. But what you're supposed to do is affirm. So like you're not being neutral, you're being positive, but be neutral, but be positively neutral.
And you're seeking to explain a very significant problem of their emotional, well-being by reifying a fictional view of self that would require lifetime feigning, a lifetime upstream swim, getting clocked, not being accepted. So you're setting this kid up unless they happen to have the perfect thread the needle of excellent passing and highly tolerant individuals that they come across. They're just going to be set up for misgendering and hate. And these are kids who, by the way, should not be pulled any further away from a foster family. And one of the things that they are doing in California is they're saying if you don't support the foster youth's gender goals, then they will put them in a different home or you can't become a foster parent.
So that is that ideological. Yeah, that acts as an ideological filter on prospective foster parents, because I'm sure, I don't know like the makeup, who generally becomes a foster parent, but I'm sure that's probably part of somebody who grew up in a Christian culture would probably be more disposed to that act of compassion of like that, because it's a tremendous amount of sacrifice that you're doing. You don't do that, generally speaking, without some sort of moral directive, transcendent moral directive. So this transgender ideology, unless it is also paired up with Christian teaching somehow, is going to, if it acts as a filter, you're cutting the system off from having that resource of people willing to dedicate their time, energy, money.
And what if they already are in a foster home? They've been there since they were 9. And then you're saying, oh, the foster parent thinks it's not trans, it's from the uncle who molested. That's where this I hate my breasts is coming from, right? Very good foster parent, very loving, not a bigot at all. And that kid is then in danger of having to go. And if you don't think that foster children will do things where they make themselves have to go, then you haven't worked with very many of them, because there's a certain amount of, let me just make the bad thing happen now.
Yeah.
Oh.
Let me just make it happen now so I don't have to be like, TikTok, when is it going to happen?
Yeah. Wow.
And so it's just massive, massive incomprehension of the kind of problems that these kids are having and where they're coming from and how they're better dealt with. And there is no fast way to deal with them. And it's, if you haven't been co-regulated as a little child, you need co-regulation as a teenager or as an adult. You need, that's what a therapist is giving an adult who goes in, is they're sitting with you, letting you know that there's like kind of nothing you can blurt out that's going to upset their apple cart, that they're going to self-regulate, they're going to be fine regardless of where you go. And little by little, you start to trust them. And then you get the feeling that as you start to get agitated, they can help you come back down. and you start to trust you're being co-regulated. Well, once you've been co-regulated, you start learning how to regulate yourself. And that's pretty much, but it's a long process with a scared child, and you can't delegate it to an intern.
Yeah. And additionally, this identity or claiming this identity gives them a lot of power. It says here in these guidelines to promote the safety, permanency, whatever that means, I guess permanency. That's probably doing a lot of work there, and well-being of individual.
Placement, probably.
Probably permanent placement. But in with regard to like the fluid gender identity, like how are you helping them be? Well, anyway, so to promote the safety, permanency, and well-being of individual TG&C children, child welfare professionals should stay up to date on the basics of gender, which is changing radically all the time, as Eliza is well documented. Adopt an individualized gender affirmative approach. So it's automatically your bias towards whatever the prevailing reigning ideology is, which we know leads to surgical and hormonal interventions. And then intervene to protect these children from any intervention by licensed or unlicensed practitioners aimed at converting or changing their gender identity or expression. So they have a tremendous amount of power over their so-called identity that everybody has to respect. If they already have a hard time connecting, like you're insinuating, this is another way for them to control the situation, and to not have to go through the process of development that they were robbed of by their circumstances, right?
And there's almost nothing else they can control. Yeah. They cannot control very much.
Their emotions. They can't control
themselves, their emotions. They can't control their flea-bitten parents who are failing them. They can't see their brother who's in a different state. They need permission to dye their hair yellow, like they have no control. And then this one magical area, body modification, affirmation, spangled glitter. And it's just such a rigged game, and the other thing is, if you look at this group of kids in general, and I think it kind of extends beyond foster youth to other trans-identified youth, that, they've never met a body modification they didn't want, or a piercing, or a tattoo. It's like this, I see this lack of self, unselved feeling among all of these kids, and they're trying to get it by pasting it onto the outside. Will that give me an inside? Will that, will I suddenly feel like now I belong in my body? And will I feel ease in my physical self? And again, if you're afraid of your own emotions, you are never in your body. You are never at ease in your physical self. You are always monitoring. Is something going to agitate me? Will I need to remove myself from the situation? Am I going to lose my cool and cry or whatever? They are monitoring all the time, because it's like, just a terrible, fate worse than death if you explode and lose rein on your feelings at school or something like that,
Yeah. This is actually horrific. I mean, this document, what you're saying is the humane approach. This document also says social workers are not responsible for determining the appropriate treatment protocols for TG&C children. The worker's role is to ensure that TG&C children have access to competent health and behavioral health clinicians who are experienced in providing gender affirming care. It's so rigged to just affirm. It's so rigged. Yep. This is like this. I don't see how you don't see this as eugenics perpetrated on undesirables, just trying to cut off undesirables from reproducing, which is like a long time progressive liberal project. Has always been lurking in these social constructivist social engineering circles. And here it is. It's perfectly, and you're not responsible for determining, but you have to determine that there's only one kind of care.
Yeah,
but
you're not responsible to facilitate it.
But you have to facilitate it.
When I was a CASA, at that point in time, CASAs were not constrained to have to affirm. And I am not sure what the situation is right now, because we're volunteers. and, kind of like the nice auntie or the nice friend or the teacher's assistant figure, they did not have any rules for what CASAs could or couldn't say. And so I think it would be interesting to find out. But I think as a CASA, you know this child, right? You know everyone in their life. You know stuff about them they don't know about themselves. A lot of stuff. And the idea in the court in California is the CASA knows probably better than anyone what needs to happen, better than the kid themselves. And you can explain it in your report, like, this kid wants to do X, but I think, I'm advocating for Y, and here is the reason, and I think that any CASA that didn't say to a kid, wow, it seems like there's 7 or 8 kinds of things that you've experienced that can cause problems with dissociation and hatred of your body. And I would hate for you to choose, like from a hat and pick the wrong one. And maybe, and that would be my approach if I were a CASA again, would be to say, I think before you make a final decision on something that you can't take back, you need to try the possibilities for resolving this distress that have no risk. Try those first and see how good you feel. And I can't believe that would be considered anything but affirming, because you're affirming reality and their long-term best interest and the fact that bad things happen to them, which is true. So, it's funny that you'd have to affirm this one notion about this one thing, and every other cockamamie idea that a teenage foster youth would have, they'd be, praying for the CASA to say, slow down, watch out. Well, this doesn't strike me as, that logical or whatever.
Yeah, you have to affirm the one thing that is a rejection of everything else. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, this document, I'm sure probably mirrors where a lot of this lobbying comes from. ACLU, for some reason, the National Center for Lesbian Rights.
Does it have
No, they were captured a long time ago.
Does it have a date on it?
Does it have a date on it? No, it doesn't have a date on it. Probably in the URL might have a date in it or something, but no, doesn't have a date. But yeah, interesting. The National Center for Lesbian Rights. We know that what's happening to the lesbian community is it's being almost at least the whole butch side of it is just being transed, like by itself. Like it's just it's really interesting. They're pushing for it. But we know that it's kind of basically female erasure in certain ways. I know that's kind of a political term, but it really does. It is facet of lesbian erasure to instead of accepting the child as a woman attracted to women or a woman who naturally expresses masculine characteristics, to then affirm that and medically alter them. It's one thing for an adult to do that, but the whole system, the California system, is on board with this. So it's not for question. Like here's the document telling people that you have to do this. And then it also goes into the whole section about how to place children. And you're right. They have to find a gender affirming home. So the whole system's rigged. And then additionally, downstream of this, if they are wards of the state, then it's California taxpayers who are paying for this. Right?
Medicaid.
Yeah, Medicaid. So the federal government and or like the federal taxpayer and this state taxpayer are paying for it.
Yeah.
How to fix it? Tell me, ladies.
Well, from the front end, if you can provide attachment-focused talk therapy, not with interns, or somatic kinds of therapy that help a person feel better in their body, which is more to do with the right brain, less to do with talking, you know, could be things like neurofeedback, could be things like sensory motor psychotherapy, where you're just moving and then attending to the feelings in your body as you move or as you talk about things. Because that's what's missing in a dissociative person, is the ability to like track time and space in their body and what their feelings are telling them about run away or you're safe, it's okay. That's what they can't do very well. So that would help an awful lot. And there are 5 or 6 kinds of things. EMDR is another that are effective for PTSD and trauma. And, you know, and then it's stuff like some of the stuff that I tried to do with my CASA youth, things like horseback riding and tennis. Gross motor things are very regulating. Think about playing catch, you know, with someone cooperative. You're moving together, you're predicting one another. It's pretty safe. It's kind of fun. Those kinds of things work well for traumatized kids. So that would
but
help.
Are they
a
gender
lot.
affirming? Or any of these things gender affirming? So.
Well, maybe if you take care of that when they're 3 through 11, they never like get to the point where they're a tween and they're still, you know, in so much distress. If I could make one change, you know, like the first change would just be to say, sure, stay open to the fact that this person may be gender nonconforming. Require that of all foster parents. If this kid winds up not conforming, you're going to be on board with that. You're going to be okay with it. But that's a far cry from validating as true any idea that, you know, washes up. I think it's perfectly okay to have equanimity about, you know, oh, you feel more boyish than you do girlish? Oh, explain how if you were a boy, your life would differ. You know, what would get better for you? I mean, I think that'd be fine to do. You know, that's exactly what you should do, is be curious about it. And but imagine if you're never listened to, you have no power, and suddenly in the realm of gender, you are the king or the queen, you know.
Eliza, you have any ideas? This is just, I mean, on a systems level, this is messed up.
Yeah, this is pretty bad. I mean, it's definitely stopped teaching kids in school that they can be born in the wrong body. Like, there has to be, you know, Laura's talking about the stuff early in life where it's like, shrink the pool of kids who are susceptible to gender nonsense. After that, stop putting gender nonsense in the pool of susceptible children. You know, it just seems like such a big deal. And I was wondering if you were involved with that California ballot measure. I don't know a whole lot about it.
I am aware of it. I haven't been particularly involved, but there's a Aaron Friday is sort of the lead dog on this, and there's going to be, where they're trying to gather signatures right now for a ballot measure that would prohibit medicalization of gender under 18 and would prohibit keeping what's going on at school away from parents. So I think that's a good effort and should probably do more to assist them.
What's your gig now, Laura?
Well, I'm sort of semi-retired. I'm writing still. I'm a grandma, so I like to keep myself available for that. I've got a real estate license. I mean, I do various different little things, but pretty much like getting ready not to have too much responsibility if I can possibly achieve it.
But you've undertaken to communicate or dedicate your writing skills to this issue.
Yeah, I'm working on a book in the area, so that's part of it.
What's the kind of the framework you're working on?
Well, I think I have a certain body of information. It's a matter, the framing is actually the trickiest part, but what I'm toying with right now is talking about restoring the dyad,
Mm-hmm.
and dyadic care being one-on-one care that human children are designed to get, including a lot of body contact, carrying, mirroring, co-regulation, external co-regulation, and talking about how, as we have diminished dyadic care, we are growing mentally distressed children. So I think it's
Are you
very
talking about
connected.
across the board, like with just care with regard to parenting? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about beyond parenting?
Well, I'm talking about, for example, like newborns going to daycare instead
Mm-hmm.
of having a mother kind of attending their emotional states all day. They have to be the most needy out of five kids
Mm,
to get the same attention,
yeah.
on them. Um, and I think that basically started in America. You couldn't take a baby to group daycare at Kinder Care or one of those organizations. You couldn't do that before 1985. They had to be over age one. And in 1985, they said, okay, no minimum age. And it's pretty, it was a pretty big nudge to the mental health graph. And then I think social media just was the death blow.
Mm,
The smartphone was a death blow, but the kids were already, if you look in like 2010, 2008, 2010, it started being a lot of talk about the snowflakes who couldn't launch in college,
Mm-hmm.
and that they needed safe spaces and,
yeah.
puppies to pet during exams. And that was around 2008, 2009, as I recall it. So the kids were already showing signs of not coalescing as sturdy selves
Yeah.
Mm.
before gender, and gender hit rapidly thereafter, like about 4 years later, boom. Um, So I think, and also we know, like, you don't take a puppy away from their mother at too young an age, or a cat
Mm-hmm.
or anybody. Um, and we're a species where our survival organ is our brain. Um, and our brain is, before we have verbal skills and linear thought, our brain is simply tracking our body sensations and whether someone's paying attention to us,
Mhm.
and that's pretty much it. And so it's like, if you're lying there in space and no one's paying attention to you, you're dissociating just slightly if you're a baby.
Mm.
Okay.
Um, And I think that, I think that we're not going to ask enough of our country to support good solutions for poor mothers or vulnerable young women having babies that are going to be everybody's either problem or everybody's benefit in our whole society. We've got to do better helping these young families launch. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And if everybody understood the importance of 0 to 3, I think you'd see more people stepping forward. You'd see more aunts and uncles stepping forward, more grandparents stepping
Mm.
forward, more neighbors stepping forward. And if people just understood, oh, we want to cook up a happy society, make babies happy, make them happy, keep them happy.
Mhm.
And instead we have a culture that says, don't spoil them,
Well,
which
I guess,
is,
yeah, that's the trade-off. That's what I was thinking. I think you're trying to aim about or at kind of sussing out the difference between proper love and care and then just indulging every whim rather than giving the correct amount or type of attention. You're giving like this with this gender affirmative attention. You're giving
Mm-hmm.
them attention, but it's cheap attention because it has to go through this one lens that doesn't have any skepticism involved, any sort of back and forth involved, any sort of challenge involved other than You just affirming, I guess. So, but you are at least giving them a good attention according to this
Well,
very
that's
limited
probably
definition.
just, it's shallow. Like you say, it's a shallow form of attention, because real attention would be to say, I think there's something else going on,
Yeah.
burbling along under the surface there. And let's talk about that. Or real attention, and seems to me real love, you can't say, oh, Susie's dead now, and now you're, Stephen.
Hmm.
How have you loved Susie? If you just chuck her out the window, I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes with a self-hating person, you have to love them when they hate themselves. And that's what they need.
Hmm.
And there was something else you said about the positive. I think what we're doing as a society is we're neglecting infants, and then we're overindulging grade school kids.
Hmm.
So just when they should be going off to walk their 7 blocks to school, carefully crossing the road, that's when people are hovering, because they've neglected the early on ramp to making that kid self-managed. And then they can't self-manage. And then it's the iPhone and the hovering and the concierging.
Wow. Yeah.
And also, Benjamin, I personally think that we're seeing young adults that are showing this lack of attachment and healthy development, and they don't see the difference between concierging the gender wishes of a kid and, devil's advocate Socratic dialogue about, well, what do you imagine when you say this? What do you mean by that? It's astonishing to me that so much credulity is placed on, and especially by anyone my age. I'm 62 years old. This didn't exist for 3 of my children growing up. The word gender never uttered. In my childhood, word gender never uttered. If you heard the word gender, it was in college, and it had to do with bullshit gender expectations, stereotypes. And so that was, the first 50 years of my life. And, it's like, how do people, I'm just
you just have too long of a memory.
Oh,
is every school in California run by people under, 37? Like, I just can't believe it. What are the old people thinking and doing?
Yeah, there's a year zero aspect to this cultural amnesia, like gender, and then gender was born, and then the trans kid was born, and everything else was forgotten.
Was subsumed, yes. Yeah. And how handy the scapegoats of the gender world are the very people like me,
who know better,
TERFs, who know better, who've raised children, who've seen like the correlation between the kinds of things that make for healthy, sturdy children and the kind of things that make for unhappy, troubled children. And we've seen it in our families, in our communities, our neighborhoods, and our schools. And we've been there and we've done it. And now we're out to the other side, and we don't have a horse in the race. And we have a lot to share. And gender basically says, listen to the children and let them lead us. I mean, it's so upsetting, the dereliction of adults to assume their own adult, logical, protective, guardian responsibility to children, and then concurrently adultifying children past, any logical point, and deferring so utterly in the one area that is going to wreck them physically, wreck their sexuality, wreck them for relationships. It's going to just do everything that's going to hurt them from having a sturdy life. And personally, I don't care one bit if someone wants to consider themselves a boy. Just don't give them chemicals and surgeries, It's very, very hard to fathom how much damage is happening And I guess I mean, the stats that you're talking about, 5%, I saw 7.5% of foster and former foster youth. So that's why I asked you what year it was.
I'm sure it's probably
that
jumping. Yeah, I'm
that
sure
might
it's
be
going up.
2018 or
Yeah.
because I think it's ticking up everywhere.
Yeah, I just wonder, like the financial. At some point, they're just going to run out of money to be able to afford this, so they'd probably have to stop. What's the limiting principle? If they wait until
Maybe
there's
if they had a
20%?
class action lawsuit from detransitioned
Yeah,
kids who were
foster. Yeah,
affirmed in
yeah,
foster care.
yeah,
I've written several op-eds that I can't get placed. You know, I thought people would listen to a CASA. I thought people would listen to me because I've taken an oath before a judge to advocate in the best interest of the child at all times.
yeah.
But and I do think there's probably causes out there that are maybe less well read about child development and well-meaning, and they hear the social worker say, "Oh, yes, we affirm, and this is what we do," and da da da, and they're probably affirming, you know, because that would be person by person. You make your own choices as a CASA, so there's probably people that have a magical belief, like the state of California has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The entire state.
But some of it might fall apart if the American Academy of Pediatrics and Rafferty, they're being sued now by two of the detransitioners. And so if that AAP statement goes belly up, I think that might create some shockwaves in whatever the various states doing these sanctuary programs.
Well, yeah, but there's also just these advocacy organizations. I don't know how you're going to tackle the Human Rights Campaign, UNESCO, and the ACLU. I mean, that's a longer process of just eroding their sway, their respectability.
Somebody bought all those entities. You know, the funders of those entities have had this agenda. There's no way that like separately and simultaneously everybody would come to agreement with no public dialogue on this radical change. It was very backdoor, and I mean, like if what was the lesbian group?
The National Center for Lesbian Rights.
You know, somebody probably just gave them a really big donation saying, get on board.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure that's how they got the ACLU. How is the ACLU arguing for the male rapist in the female jail?
They're a civil liberties union, and it's the civil liberty for a rapist to sleep with whom he wants. Sorry. Who are you to tell the bepenist woman where she should shack?
Yeah, but how about all the non-bepenist women? Who do they want to be with?
Well, I mean, there are trade-offs, of course, but we have to honor the liberties of the highest person on the oppression pole. And they're a little further down, and they're criminals anyway. So why should we respect their wishes? They gave that up.
I think you're 100% onto it, that they, like the foster youth, are throwaways in the eyes of a lot of the decision makers.
All these categories of people who can be written off in advance no matter what happens to them is acceptable.
Yeah.
Which I know is when we talked to Jamie a couple of months ago, like that was one of the things she said that she was so upset about was feeling like these health centers that are devoted in name to LGBT people, they treat them like disposable people.
Very little follow-up.
Yeah, they don't. It would not be acceptable with another group of patients to provide that poor level of care on that poor level of evidence with that poor follow-up and those poor outcomes.
If you've heard any of the testimonies of some of the families of people who were being pressured to transition, And, the grandmothers and aunts that were testifying and saying, this didn't seem to be her problem, but they were pushing us. And you see that the whole time. You just see that these are what's disenfranchised people and families being ignored, being pressured, being bossed around.
Just imagine you putting all those resources, like personal, your love, your attention, your energy, your money, into a child that's not your own child. And then that child is irrevocably just changed. And you have to stand by and watch or let the child go. And then, and then it turns out to be a mistake. I just like this tragedy of the child coming back is like, I'm a detransitioner now. Why did you allow that? Like, you were out of my hands. Like, just the amount of betrayal
it's
that
a Greek
child
tragedy for sure.
has experienced, and then another betrayal, and then another betrayal, and all the good-meaning people are explicitly cut out of the loop by these policies.
Yeah. And the people who mean well and are ignorant, they will have to live someday with all of the guilt of having nodded and, waved it through.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of the petty functionary, I think a lot of them are just like, I talk to them every day on Twitter because I bother answering people, what's the matter with you, you transphobe? And I'll just say, like, come on, think about it this way. It's just shocking to me. They haven't thought it through. They don't know. They just hear gender affirming care. It's a brilliant Orwellian term. Brilliant. Gender, what are they talking about? Don't know. Affirming, oh, sounds good.
Sounds nice. Care. Well, what could go wrong? Benjamin and I have talked about this before, where it's like, okay, what is that group of people going to do in the future, and what are they going to tell themselves? And one of the things that I do see happening is this redefinition of gender affirming care, even really significantly within the last year, to cover ever more territory and to cover ever more innocuous things, like telling a girl it's okay to wear a dress, or like dyeing your roots, or like taking birth control. And that kind of thing, I think that one of its functions is, evangelizing. You can say, well, why are you opposed to this? Like, it's really benign. Everybody does it. We only think it's a problem when trans people want to do it. But the other function that that's going to have is that the people who supported this are going to be able to say that they supported gender affirming care the whole time, and under the banner of whatever it means at that moment.
Yeah, the Bailey keeps on growing bigger and bigger to kind of forgive.
Right, they're going to be like, no, of course I supported gender affirming care the whole time. Like, what would be wrong with, like, it was just dye your hair, tell them it's okay to wear whatever they want. Like, of course I did that. And it's like, and it will have meant all of these other things at other stages, like cut your breasts off. Yeah. And my guess is that's a way a lot of people are going to avoid a reckoning with the things that they supported, because it's going to be a very favorable redefinition.
Yeah, if I were Batman, meaning that I had childhood trauma that was undiagnosed and I repressed it for a long time. I also had billions of dollars and I wanted to take out vengeance, my own problems on society. I'd go after whoever the editors of Teen Vogue are. Need to be held account, man.
Jesus. Yeah.
They need to be taken down. Not out. Not a threat or anything like that. But if I was Batman, they'd be singing a song.
Yeah.
Just the people who are promoting this stuff. What's your special Dante Hell?
Antipathy for MSNBC, because I'm a liberal. I'm a Democrat. I've voted... I've cast one vote for Republican in my entire life, and I've rarely missed an election of any scale. And I see this propaganda regarding gender. Zero. I find Rachel Maddow I want to shake her. You're a lesbian lady. You know what's going on here. And they won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Although Joy Reid had Tiffany Justice on her show. It was very interesting. I was shocked and surprised to see that But it's very upsetting because the other thing I think is going on is just a lot of these journalists are, 32 years old. And so they haven't had an experience of raising children, and they haven't lived as adults in the pre-gender era, and they're not getting any of the information about developmental trauma, so they're just thinking.
And don't have any common sense. That's a real hang up. Yeah.
Yeah.
All virtue, no signal.
Yeah, but it's just sort of, it just boggles my mind. It's like every other thing, lesbian, gay, mentally ill, bipolar, suicidal, all of these things have existed for millennia. And suddenly this thing that has existed for 10 years is like the be-all, end-all, instant explainer, decoder ring. You're like, what?
I see you haven't read a whole lot about Byzantine frameworks of transmisogyny and how the Middle Ages were a trans utopia, but you should maybe do your homework.
Yeah.
Way to tout your credentials there, little Miss Reader.
Yeah.
I've missed that.
Yeah, some people have been
journal.
writing some fan fiction in the history department. Let's just put it that way.
Well, yeah.
Which I didn't know was an option. I mean, yeah.
Well, all the boring history has been written. It's time to queer history.
Time to go back and queer the Middle Ages.
Yeah, queering the Middle Ages. Yeah.
The trans utopia was my favorite part. Well, actually, I think my favorite part is that they exported the same untenable dynamics that they say exists currently into the Middle Ages, where trans people are simultaneously persecuted and held to be widely recognized to be really close to the divine.
Yeah.
And it's like, I would think, if I were rewriting history, I would probably say it sucks, but you have to pick one.
Yeah. Well,
but,
yeah. It's this magical box. But
right.
the angel devil.
But the desire to hang on to the extreme polarities so that it can be great and powerful and powerless and
exceptional and ordinary.
persecuted and vindicated. And
their history has to first of all put them in history.
Yes.
And then it has to not make them too downtrodden, because then it wouldn't be affirming.
Right.
So then there has to be the sort of, well,
but
we were
it has to be
we were holy.
Downtrodden enough that we should all feel bad now, having all been descended from people who were alive during the Middle Ages. It was a burden that we all have to bear.
It's actually a good skit, gender affirming history. That would be a great skit.
It could be like the new drunk history.
Yeah,
I would do it. Do the new drunk history.
Well, ladies, where can people find your work?
Well, I'm on Twitter. It's at Haynes_Wiley, HAYNES_WILEY. And I say hello.
And I'm on Twitter too, Eliza Mondegreen, and the same on Substack.
Mm-hmm. Anything coming up, Eliza?
I fell into the weird world of tulpomancy a couple weeks ago.
Tulpomancy. What is this magic?
What is this magic? It's basically people self-inducing dissociative identity disorders because they're lonely and or horny. But more later.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll have to do a special thing on that because the person who fell in love with themselves.
Yes.
That's some good fodder.
Yeah. So it's coming.
Yeah. Good. Well, that's a safe form of polyamory too. If you just kind of fracture your consciousness, right?
Yeah, but what do you do if you fight? I mean, who's sleeping on the couch?
Yeah, who's sleeping on the couch? Good stuff. Well, thank you very much, both very much for coming on the show. Liz, it's always great to have you on. Laura, it's great to meet you and to hear your experience.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'll link links to your Twitters and your work too, and send us a couple articles if you don't mind for people to check out.
Okay.
Thank you.